starting from the first keynote speaker, we are so honored that we have the chance to have Professor Ellis here with us. I see he's already joining us this morning. Prof. Ellis, we are so honored that you have the time to participate in our conference today. Before we start with your sessions, Prof, allow me to briefly introduce yourself to our audience. Hopefully they will automatically connect yourself with the famous Prof. Ellis on the world of second language acquisition. Professor Roderick Ellis, or more known as Prof. Ellis, is the professor in the Department of Applied Studies and Linguistics at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He has worked in Zambia, in the UK, Japan, Australia, and the USA for extended periods. Prof. Ellis is a Kenneth Mildenberg Prize-winning British linguist winning prize. He is currently a research professor and also teaching English at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. During his 30 years of research, Prof. Ellis has authored and co-authored more than 40 distinct publications. In his publication work includes articles and books on second language acquisition, language teaching, and teacher education. His latest book is Becoming and Being an Applied Linguist, together with John Benjamin. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Ellis. But we also noted that his also other recent publication includes Language Teaching Research and Language Pedagogy in 2012, Exploring Language Pedagogy and Second Language Acquisition Research in 2014, and also Understanding Second Language Acquisition, second edition in 2015. Prof. Ellis has also published several English language textbooks, include Impact Grammar. He's definitely a leading theorist of task-based learning and has published 2 books and more than a dozen articles on the subjects. Professor Ellis' research interests include second language acquisition for sure, individual learning differences, form-focused instruction, teacher education, course design, and methodology of language teaching. In the field of second language acquisition, Prof. Ellis has focused more on task-based learning teaching, or TBLT, and also draws important definitions provided by the scholars, namely David Noonan, Graham Crooks, and etc., by focusing on successful convenience of language. Prof. Ellis, hopefully we do justice to your works for these years, but if we have something that incorrect, please do apologize. Prof. Ellis, if you are here with us already, the time is yours. We welcome your presentation. Prof. Ellis.
Yes, hello.
Good morning, sir. Leave the screen to you.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm actually in Auckland, New Zealand, where it's a beautiful early summer's day here. I do have to make a little correction in terms of my bio, because unfortunately you're looking at an old copy. And you can see that I'm not actually working for the University of Auckland at the moment. I'm actually working for Curtin University in Perth, Australia. So I live in New Zealand, but I actually work for Curtin University. And also I have a visiting professorship at Shanghai International Studies University as well. Thank you very much for showing me the little video. It's a part of Indonesia that I have never been able to visit. And I do hope that in the future, I have an opportunity to do so. Okay, I think I can get started. on my talk. I plan to talk for somewhere around about 45 minutes, and then to allow time for questions. And I think that there is a chat facility on Zoom. And if you want, you can put your questions into there. You can either wait until I've finished, or as you hear my talk, you can enter a question, and then we'll go over those questions at the end of my talk. Okay, you can see that I'm going to talk on correcting errors in L2 writing. This is one of the areas of second language acquisition and language teaching that I've always been interested in. And it seems to me a very important area, because most teachers at some time have to correct their students' written work. And I think it's useful to look at the sort of options that are available for correcting errors in your students, and also look at a little bit of the research that's investigated the effect of correcting errors in L2 writing. Okay, I'm going to begin with some controversies. Many aspects of second language acquisition and many aspects of language pedagogy are controversial, in the sense that there are very different positions. And I think one of the purposes of someone like me is to look at the evidence and to ask ourselves, what do we make of these controversies? Is it possible to actually come out on one side or the other? So I'm going to start with the work of Truscott. There's a little picture of him. I think he works in Taiwan, not sure whether he's still working there. And his position has been that correcting errors in students' writing is a waste of time. And he argues that, well, mainly a waste of time. He sees some limited possible effect for it. And his main reason is because he doesn't think that correcting errors contributes to the acquisition of what he calls genuine knowledge of language. And what he means by genuine knowledge of language is the linguistic knowledge that we draw on when we're not thinking about trying to be correct, when we're simply focusing on trying to communicate. Another term often used for genuine knowledge of language is implicit knowledge. So he's saying that basically correcting errors doesn't contribute to the development of implicit knowledge. And he goes further, because he suggests that it can actually have a negative effect, because it can cause learners to avoid using problematic grammatical structures. If they feel that they have to be correct, they might avoid those particular grammatical structures that they're not sure of. But we know that you learn by doing, and thus learners need to actually make use of whatever knowledge they have as a way of actually improving it. He does see some limited effect. He says it can have an impact on the explicit knowledge. And this is the knowledge that we use when we're doing grammar tests, or when we are monitoring what we say or what we write, in order to try to make sure that we don't make any errors. And the position that Truscott takes is that explicit knowledge is very different to genuine knowledge of language. And this is now actually widely recognized in second language acquisition research. So he's saying, okay, correcting errors may help a bit with explicit knowledge, but it doesn't really help with what is important in acquisition, which is the development of implicit knowledge. So it has very limited effect. A very alternative position has been put forward by Dana Ferris. And she argues that written corrective feedback is a valuable pedagogic tool because it can help learners to write more accurately when they are revising a first draft. And also in the long term, it can help them to be more accurate when they are doing a new piece of writing as well. So she argues that corrective feedback does actually contribute to the kind of knowledge needed to revise, explicit knowledge, but also the kind of knowledge that we use in a new piece of writing when we are not focused necessarily on being correct all the time. So that's a very different position. And obviously, Ferris is arguing that corrective feedback has a major role to play in helping people to write and in helping people to learn a second language, both. So two very different positions. I think it is possible to reconcile these positions, and this is possibly pretty close to what I believe. I think that Truscott might be right in asserting that error correction does not contribute to what he called genuine knowledge of language, what I've called implicit knowledge. But I think he is wrong in claiming that it has no effect on accuracy when we are writing for communicative purposes, because I think error correction may be effective because it assists learners' explicit knowledge. And my argument is that learners are able to use their explicit knowledge in order to try to eliminate errors in their writing. I think all writers, native speakers, as well as second language learners, do draw on their explicit knowledge of, say, grammar rules in order to try to ensure that they don't make errors or to correct something that they have just written. So if we are looking at the whole issue of error correction from the point of view, does it help writing? I think the answer is quite clearly, yes, it does. But maybe its role in developing implicit knowledge, as Truscott said, is limited. So the difference between my position and Truscott's position is that Truscott really sees only implicit knowledge as important and plays down the value of explicit knowledge. And I see explicit knowledge as a different kind of knowledge, but one that is very valuable to second language learners and that they are able to use when writing. So these are different positions. Now, what I'm going to do in the rest of my talk is, first of all, to try to show you different ways in which people have suggested you can do corrective feedback. And as I go through them, I will look at the advantages and disadvantages of both and invite you to think about what your own views are, which particular type of corrective feedback you favor. I think I should make one point quite clear from the start, and that is that what type of corrective feedback works best will depend on different learners, in particular, learners' proficiency. So low proficiency learners may need a different type of corrective feedback to learners of higher proficiency. So it's not just a question of which type is best all the time, but more a question of which type suits your particular language learners. Now, as I go through the various options, we need, first of all, to make it clear what we mean by feedback on writing. And of course, you can provide feedback on three different things. You can provide feedback on content. You can provide feedback on the organization, the extent to which someone has organized their ideas effectively. And you can provide feedback on the language, on errors that learners have made. Now, I need to make it quite clear that my focus is entirely on the third of these, corrective feedback, but I'm not suggesting that feedback on content and organization is not also important, but that would be a different talk, not the one that I'm going to do today. We can see that there are two aims at corrective feedback. One aim is to enable students to revise their own writing. So once they have written a draft, they receive feedback, and then they can use that feedback to produce a better draft. And the other aim of corrective feedback is to assist students to acquire correct English. That's what Truscott thinks corrective feedback does not do. But I think, and Ferris thinks, that yes, it can contribute. Okay, so now let's turn to the various options. And first of all, I need to distinguish two dimensions of written corrective feedback that you need to think about. The first is the different ways in which you can do it, the strategies for providing corrective feedback. And the second is how you want the students to respond to the feedback. There are options there as well, and I'm going to deal with both. So let's start with the first. And I'm going to look at three basic strategies: direct written corrective feedback, indirect written corrective feedback, and metalinguistic written corrective feedback. I'm going to give examples of both and look at the pros and the cons. So let's start with direct written feedback. This is where the teacher provides the student with the correct form. And therefore, it's said that in direct written corrective feedback, you are providing the student with both negative and positive evidence. Negative evidence, you're showing them what is wrong, and positive evidence, you're actually giving them the correct form. But there are still a number of different ways of doing direct written corrective feedback. One is to simply cross out an unnecessary word, phrase, or morpheme, and then to insert a missing word or morpheme. Or thirdly, writing the correct form above or near to the incorrect form. And usually when people do direct written corrective feedback, they use all three of those ways of doing it. So here's an example. This actually comes from a study that I conducted in Japan some time ago, where the students, they were first-year general English students, first-year university general English students, and they were shown a picture story and simply asked to write the narrative, write the story that the pictures told. And you can see here that I have decided to focus the correction on articles, the indefinite article and the definite article the. And you can see that I crossing out words and putting the correct article in, and where there's a missing article, I use a cursor to show the missing article, etc. In this example, I also corrected a preposition error. When the dog was going through the bridge should be when the dog is going over the bridge, etc. Okay. So obviously, correction such as this shows learners when they should be using and when they should be using the. But it doesn't explain why they should be using or why they should be using It just gives them examples, an opportunity to learn from input, to learn from the corrections that you are making. So what is the advantage of direct written corrective feedback? Well, obviously, the huge advantage is that it provides learners with explicit guidance about how to correct their errors. It gives them the correction. And obviously, if learners are fairly beginner level learners, or if learners make lots and lots of errors in a particular grammatical structure like articles, then giving them the actual correction is probably better than just simply showing them that they've made an error. But there is a disadvantage, and I think this disadvantage comes into play more with learners of higher proficiency, learners who have perhaps already internalized some kind of idea about when they should be using the indefinite article and the definite article. So the disadvantage is that it requires minimal processing by learners, because all they've got to do is to look at the correction, and if they are asked to revise, copy out the correction. So minimal processing. But it does help them to produce the correct form when they revise their writing. Perhaps then this does help in terms of producing a more accurate, better revised text, if that's what you want your students to be able to do. But maybe it doesn't contribute much to long learning because there's no the processing is only minimal. They don't really have to sit and work out when to use when to use the. So maybe better used with low proficiency learners. Turning now to indirect written corrective feedback. This is where students have made an error and you don't provide them with the correct form. You simply indicate that they have made an error without correcting it, therefore. So technically, this means that you are only providing them with negative evidence. You're not also providing them with positive evidence, the correct form. And this can take different forms, and these different forms work in different ways. One is to simply underline the errors. One is to use cursors to show omissions in the student's text. And both of those, you make the corrections in the actual text. But the other possibility might be to just put a cross in the margin next to the line of the text that contains the error. In other words, this tells them that somewhere in that line, there is an error, but it doesn't show them where. So obviously underlining errors and using cursors to show omissions actually shows learners the location of the error, whereas just putting a cross in the margin does not show them the location of the error. So here is an example, and you can see here that I've used a blue cross to show that there's a missing word, and I have used a yellow cross between a line to show that there is a wrong word, etc. Okay. And here I have corrected not just articles, but also other errors as well. Okay. So what am I telling them? I'm telling them that they've missed a word. I'm telling them that they've used a wrong word. Of course, they don't know what the correct word is. They don't know what the missing word is. They have to work that out for themselves. But I'm also, in this example, showing them the location of the error, the actual word where there is an error. Many people think that this is a better way of correcting because they think that it caters to guided learning and problem solving. And many people think that learning that is guided, helping learners to work out something that is correct for themselves through problem solving, is better than just simply giving them the correction. And obviously, indirect WCF encourages students to reflect about linguistic forms. They don't have to reflect. They can just say, oh, I think it should be X. But maybe it encourages them to think, why is this wrong? There's a word missing. Why is there a word missing here? In other words, not just what, in order to make the correction, but why, working out the rule or the explanation for the error and for the correct form. And Ferris and Roberts have argued that this is more likely to lead to long-term learning. So if we are more concerned with acquisition, perhaps this will work better than just giving learners the correction. Disadvantages: learners cannot correct if they do not know the correct form. Obviously, if they have no idea how to make the correction, then the indirect WCF is not going to be any use to them. And another possibility is that they may be able to put in a correction of some kinds, but they're not certain. In other words, it doesn't really help them to be sure that the correction that they put in is actually the correct one. We now move to the third type, which is metalinguistic explanation. And this is really quite different because it involves giving learners explicit comments that explain the errors that they have made. So it's not just a question of showing them that they've made an error. They are now actually given an explanation for the error and the rule that they have broken. And this can be done in different ways. One very common way is to use error codes. That is to say, you work out a number of labels for different kinds of errors. So, for example, for an error in the use of you may have a label that would say in-def A for in-def article. If you have an error in preposition, then you would perhaps, the label might simply be P or prep, etc. And you can put these labels over the actual location where the error occurs, or you can simply put the labels in the margin of the line where the error occurs. The second way is to provide metalinguistic clues, and this is where you number errors as they occur in the text, and then at the bottom of the student's text, you provide brief metalinguistic comments, brief explanations of the errors that they have made. And the final way is to give them a handout that actually provides a very detailed metalinguistic explanation of some specific error type that they have made in their writing, etc. And I'm now going to show you examples of each of these, okay? This is an example of using error codes. So there you've got the text, and you can see that I have written the labels for the different types of error in the margin, in the example at the top, and in the example below, I've written them immediately over the error that they have made, okay? Obviously, putting the labels in the margin means learners have to do a lot more work, mental work, because they've actually got to work out where the error occurs. Whereas in the example at the bottom, they're shown where the error occurs, okay? So the idea is that you give them these metalinguistic codes, and then they can use these to work out the corrections that they need to make. So you're not giving them the corrections. It's not the same as direct correction, but you are giving them guidance, metalinguistic guidance about the errors. Here is the second way of doing it. And this is where you have a text, and then the errors are numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 errors, in this case, article errors. And then underneath you have the numbers, and then an explanation of what they need to do to correct the error. So, for example, for 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7, it's all the same error. You need before the noun when a person or thing is mentioned for the first time. And then errors 4 and 8, you need the before the noun when the person or thing has been mentioned previously. And then there's an explanation for 5, through the bridge, which is an error, where they have to use over the bridge. And an explanation of why over is needed and through is not appropriate, etc. Okay. This is the third way, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I can make a comment of my PowerPoint available to you so that if you want to look at it after the conference, you can do so. I will be sending a copy to the organizers, okay? But the idea here is that it provides very detailed metalinguistic explanation of the article errors, the versus the errors, etc. Okay. So, and that's it. That would constitute a handout that would be given to the students. So they do a piece of writing, and you see that they're making lots of errors in articles, and you say, okay, look at this handout, and you try to use this handout to correct your errors in a revised text. Okay. I need to make one other important distinction with regard to written corrective feedback, and that is whether the written corrective feedback is focused or unfocused. Focused corrective feedback is where you elect to just correct one type of error. The examples that I've been showing you were highly focused because they were focusing on article errors. Unfocused is where you correct all or most of the errors. Obviously, it's not really a dichotomy, focused versus unfocused. You can have various degrees of focusing, very, very focused or very, very unfocused. And there are various possibilities in the middle. Now, this distinction between focused and unfocused applies to all of the previous options, direct, indirect, and metalinguistic. Although obviously, with metalinguistic handouts, basically, it's only possible to do that with focused corrective feedback, not with unfocused. So metalinguistic in general probably is going to require you to adopt a focused approach. Now, obviously, there's an issue here. Teachers do have to make a decision as to whether they want to focus their corrections on a particular type of error or try to correct most or all of the errors. And again, there are pros and cons for this. Let me see if I have a slide for this. I do indeed. Here are the advantages of unfocused WCF. Arguably, you can make tasks more authentic, because if you want to do focused CF, you probably have to try to design a task that will involve learners in having to use a particular grammatical structure when they are completing the task. And that can lead to a lack of authenticity in trying to design the task to make them use a particular grammatical structure. And you could also argue that unfocused WCF accords more with normal pedagogic practice, because you could think that perhaps a teacher's purpose in correcting his or her pupils' written work is to improve accuracy in general, not just the use of one grammatical structure. It depends really, doesn't it, on the purpose of the written task that you're giving them. If the written task is really designed to practice writing in general, then probably you want to use unfocused WCF. On the other hand, if you're designing a task because you want them to practice using a particular grammatical structure in writing, in a communicative piece of writing, then clearly focused CF would be more appropriate. And there are, I think, clear advantages of focused CF. It enhances the likelihood that learners will not just memorize specific corrections, but they will develop an awareness of the underlying rule. In other words, they'll develop explicit knowledge. And of course, teachers don't need to focus on the same grammatical problem in every written task that they give their students. They can change the written task, and maybe 1 week to focus on one particular type of error, and then in another week to focus on a different type of error, etc. So over time, by shifting the focus, they can achieve a wide range of linguistic features to focus on. So that's another decision you have to think about. Do you want to do focused? Do you want to do unfocused? You remember I said that there were two aspects to WCF. There was the actual way in which you carry out the correction, the corrective feedback strategies. And then secondly, there was the issue of students' response to WCF. And basically, there are a number of possibilities here. The main one is whether you require students to do revision or whether you don't require students to do revision. If you don't require students to do revision, then there's another choice. You can give the students their corrected piece of writing back, and you can ask them to look at the corrections and study them and think about how they will correct. Or alternatively, you just simply give the students back the corrected text. The last one, giving the students back the corrected text, would seem to have limited purpose, because unless the students themselves choose to look at their corrections, the corrections are not going to be doing anything useful. So I think basically the choices available are 1 or 2A, etc. Okay. So I've taken you through the different options for doing written corrective feedback. And what I'm going to do now is to look at some research, including research that mostly research that I've been engaged at different times. This is not my study. This is one of the best studies that I think has ever been carried out by someone called Van Beuningen. And what this researcher wanted to do is to compare the effects of direct and indirect WCF. And he looked at the English writing of 268 Dutch multilingual secondary school learners writing. So very, very big study. And what did he find? Well, interestingly, he found a slight difference depending on whether the errors that students were making were in vocabulary, lexical, or whether they were in grammar. Where lexical errors were concerned, he found no difference between the effects of direct and indirect WCA, equally effective. But he found that only direct CF resulted in significant gains in grammatical accuracy in new pieces of writing. Yes, direct CF obviously helped them to do revision, but it didn't actually result in significant gains in new pieces of writing. Now, the type of WCF in this study was unfocused, what Van Beuningen called comprehensive. In other words, he was basically correcting all errors, right? So this is a study that looks at the effect of comprehensive, unfocused WCF. And he found that only direct CF had an impact on grammar, but both equally effective for vocabulary. This is a study that I carried out with Shintani, published in 2013. This study looked at fairly low-level learners. I think Van Beuningen's learners were more mixed proficiency, including learners who might be better characterized as intermediate level. These learners, I think, were definitely pretty beginner level learners. And we looked at only one grammatical structure, so highly focused. We looked at the indefinite article, which, by the way, is the article that learners seem to make the most errors in. And we found that direct WCF had no effect on accurate use of the indefinite article, but we did include another type of WCF, metalinguistic explanation, and we found that this did lead to gains in accuracy in a new piece of writing, but only if this new piece of writing was completed immediately after the treatment, immediately after the old piece of writing had been corrected. It didn't seem to have any long-term effect. So when they were given a new writing task 2 weeks later, there was no evidence that either the direct CF or the metalinguistic explanation had any effect on it, right? So I suppose in a way, this is a study that would support Truscott's position, because there was no real evidence that it had any effect on their implicit type knowledge. It helped a bit with explicit knowledge, but only in the short term. And then 2 weeks later, they'd forgotten all about it, and they carried on making errors the same as they did originally, okay? This is another study that we were engaged in. This was with a very different group of learners. As I've said, the first group of learners were really fairly beginner level learners and also poor writers. This study was carried out in a university in Japan. And once again, we looked at both direct WCF and metalinguistic explanation. And one of the interesting things about this study was that we investigated the effect of WCF on two different grammatical structures. On the use of hypothetical conditional, we designed writing tasks that really required them to use this particular grammatical structure, and also it required them to use the indefinite article. And we found that both direct WCF and metalinguistic explanation with these more advanced type learners did seem to help with acquisition of the hypothetical conditional, but not the indefinite article. And we also found that this case, the effectiveness of the direct WCF proved longer lasting than the metalinguistic explanation. So the results of this study are quite different from the results of the first study, because it suggests here that direct WCF actually produced the greater gains in acquisition, better than metalinguistic explanation. Whereas in the other study, we didn't find much effect for either, but a little bit of effect for metalinguistic in the immediate post-test. I think there is a reason why direct WCF and helped with hypothetical conditional and not indefinite article. The hypothetical conditional carries a much more important meaning content, involves conditional sentences like if I had more time, I would come on a holiday. If I had had more time, I would have gone on holiday to Indonesia, right? Sentences like that. And showing them how to correct that type of sentence was quite essential for the content of the task. And that's why I think that the feedback had an effect. Where indefinite article, you know, if you miss out an indefinite article, it doesn't really interfere very much with the meaning. So maybe the students chose to focus more on the grammatical structure that contributed to the meaning content of what they were writing, rather than indefinite article, which didn't really contribute very much at all. This is another study that I carried out not with Shintani in this case, with other people, also in Japan, also involving university students. And I was interested in focused versus unfocused WCF here. So with one group of learners, we did focused CF, focusing on articles, and on another, we did unfocused WCF, focusing on a number of different sort of grammatical structures. But in fact, most of the errors that the students were making were article errors. So even in the unfocused condition, there were a lot of article corrections. So I'm not really certain this study worked very well because the distinction between focused and unfocused was not clear enough. And in fact, we found no difference in the effect of focused and unfocused on articles. These are other studies that have looked at focused versus unfocused, study carried out by Sheen. And she did make a much clearer distinction between the focus correction, which again focused on articles, and the unfocused WCF, which focused on a lot of different grammatical structures. And this study showed quite clearly that the focus CF led to clear gains in grammatical accuracy and new pieces of writing, whereas the unfocused didn't. And then there's another study carried out in Iran, which also found that focused WCF is more effective. So there is plenty of evidence. I haven't really gone through all the research that's looked at written corrective feedback, but there's really lots and lots of evidence that focused corrective feedback is quite effective. The Van Beuningen study that I looked at a moment ago is one of the few studies that actually consistently shows that unfocused correction is also effective. There is another possibility, which I perhaps should have put in the options when I was dealing with the options for dealing with it, which involves sort of combining focused and unfocused WCF. And this is called tiered feedback, where feedback begins by focusing on one grammatical structure and then adds an additional feature each time feedback is given, right? So you might start off with articles and then next week prepositions, and then the next week past tense, and so on, right? And you add a new focus each time you do correction. So in other words, the focus becomes gradually more and more unfocused with different pieces of writing. And Anderson investigated this, and they did find it was effective, but they found that its effective decreased as the number of corrective features increased. So as more and more features were added and it became more and more unfocused, it became less effective. Another interesting question is, should learners be told to revise? And the argument against revision is that learners learn from input, not from output. Because revision, of course, involves production, it involves output. And if you know the work of Krashen, you will know that Krashen has argued continually that output doesn't play a role, production doesn't play a role in acquisition, it's input. So if you were to go along with Krashen's arguments, then you would not ask students to revise. But there are arguments for revision. Meryl Swain has said that pushed output plays a major role in language acquisition. And we could also argue that when you're revising, it forces more careful attention to form, etc. And there is research that has definitely shown that written corrective feedback in combination with revision is more effective than written corrective feedback by itself. So I think probably the evidence here is that, yes, you should get students to revise. This is a study that I've carried out recently with one of my Sri Lankan PhD students. And we looked at two different ways of getting students to respond to the errors. One was by revising, and the other was by putting them into pairs and discussing. And we were interested in the relative effects of individual revising of texts by individual students, or putting them into pairs and discussing their errors, etc. And we found that revising led to greater accuracy in new writing than discussing in pairs. We also asked the students what they preferred, and we found that they very much preferred to have the opportunity to revise their texts individually rather than to discuss them in pairs. Interesting, because in language teaching, we're often told that pair work or group work is a really positive thing. But in this respect, it would seem that perhaps individual work might actually have a better payoff than pair work or small group work. Okay, conclusions. WCF works. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Now, it does actually not only help learners to revise their texts, it helps them to avoid making the same errors when they are writing new texts as well. But I don't think there's any clear evidence that it results in implicit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that we use for spontaneous communication, what Truscott called genuine knowledge. I think its role is probably to help in the development of explicit knowledge. And in the case of writing, explicit knowledge is useful. It can help not only revise, but to avoid errors in new writing. So, I'm near the end now. Which type of WCF is most effective? I think probably we would have to conclude that direct WCF in general has been found to be more effective than indirect. There's clear evidence that metalinguistic WCF helps, focused rather than unfocused, and written corrective feedback followed by revision. This is my last slide, and this is really just for you. I think that all teachers need to consider the various options about how to do written corrective feedback, and then they need to formulate an explicit policy for correcting errors. I think teachers need to reflect carefully on how they're going to do written corrective feedback, and that's the purpose of this talk, to give you an idea of the different options that are available so that you can reflect on them, etc. And I think also I would like to encourage teachers to engage in their own practitioner research and to evaluate the effects of their error correction. This is a little area where teachers can very easily conduct simple little studies to see to what extent learners do benefit from their correction, etc. And that's a good idea, because if ever you want a little conference presentation at conferences like this, then you have something to be able to present at that conference. And that's it. Thank you very, very much for listening. And now we do have time for questions. So I see that there are some questions in chat. So let me open up and see where we are. Oh, that's a good question. Question is, should one use a language proofreader, or should you use an online application such as Grammarly, etc.? So this is where you might be concerned with trying to find out the best way of correcting the errors that occur in your own writing, etc. I don't know. It's not an easy question to answer, because I think it depends on It depends on you partly, because Grammarly is not foolproof. It doesn't always correct correctly, and it sometimes misses errors as well. And it will also obviously depend on how good your proofreader is. What do I do with my PhD students? I try to find a really good proofreader and ask them to put their thesis through the proofreader. I mean, I do a lot of editing and correcting for them, chapter by chapter, but when they've got their whole thesis together, I ask them to do a language proofreader. I do not ask them to use Grammarly because it sometimes writes errors in. Okay. Okay. Right. Errors made about the grammar part of speech. I think obviously, in order to do effective correction, particularly focus correction, you've got to be able to very narrowly describe the particular grammar feature that you want to investigate. And part of speech is really too vague. I wouldn't consider it to be an adequate description, an adequate focus for your written corrective feedback. I mean, you might want to look at errors in noun forms, and then you would just look at the noun forms. You might want to look at errors in verb tense, right? You might want to look at an errors in preposition. But the term part of speech is really too vague and suggests to me that you haven't really conceptualized where you want to focus the corrective feedback. Do we have to correct all the grammar and give them an explanation in detail? I've really dealt with this in my lecture. There are options here. One is to correct all the errors. One is to give them explanation in detail. But if you're correcting all the errors, I don't think it's possible to give detailed explanation for all of them. If the correction is focusing on a particular error, then yes, I think providing that within an explanation is useful, because the research suggests that metalinguistic feedback can be helpful. What about the ideas in the writing? Well, as I said, feedback can focus on different things. It can focus on content and organization, or it can focus on errors. And what I've been doing in my talk is to just deal with corrective feedback, the feedback that focuses on errors. So I haven't had anything to say about content or organization. Perhaps I will say one thing. I think if you try to provide feedback on comprehensive feedback on content, organization, and errors, you might well overwhelm your students. And you might want to perhaps have an approach where sometimes you focus on written corrective feedback, their errors, and other times you focus on content and organization, but maybe not try to do everything at the same time. Which type is the least effective? On balance, the least effective is probably indirect corrective feedback, where you just simply indicate the error. In particular, unfocused indirect corrective feedback. But Van Beuningen's study did show that that seemed to work quite well as direct, with vocabulary. So it may depend, but if you're interested in grammar errors, I think probably indirect corrective feedback is often not going to be very helpful. Okay, I've come to the end of the questions that are up there. And I'm just wondering if there are any other questions that anyone wants to put up, or whether we've only got 2 minutes to go and you have to prepare for your next talk, whether I should love you and leave you.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rizky Junior Uli, and I was supposed to facilitate the question and answer sessions, but I think you have done very well. And however, we have still several questions. We have one request for Mr. Agus Semiun to ask the questions directly. So, Mr. Agus Semiun, you may proceed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, committee. Yeah, I'm happy of having this chance to talk directly to Prof. Rod Ellis. That so long I am missing to see you and to listen directly from you. You know, I still have the book you wrote about language 2. Is it, Prof? Language 2. Your book.
Okay. Yeah, great.
Yeah. Sorry. I am not talking about the feedback writing in classroom, the teachers and the students. I'm talking about the writing or scientific writing that so far I am experiencing. One very difficult problem to solve, that is about the culture. You know, as I experienced so far, I have problem to say it in English about something dealing with the culture, my culture, for example. Yeah. Something like metaphors, yeah, metaphoric language. I don't know how to translate it, yeah, how to make it clear.
I'm awfully sorry, but I don't think this is related to the topic of my talk, because you sort of brought in culture, which is a very important issue. But, you know, I mean, that would need me to give another talk while I was looking at culture, unless you are concerned with cultural differences in the attitude to corrective feedback, then perhaps it is relevant.
Okay, yeah, okay, so right, Rod, yeah. But that's my experience, you know. Probably you have a kind of solution to do that, yeah, in terms of to do writing on and on, yeah, because that is my special problem of writing a scientific paper to be published. Yeah, how to say it in English, in clear English, for those who are culturally very difficult to understand. Sorry for that. If this is not dealing with your topic. Okay, Rod Ellis, thank you very much.
I sympathize with your problem. It's a problem that many second language writers have, how to express themselves clearly in English, and I understand that. But, you know, I mean, I've really been focusing on something a bit different in this talk. Yeah. So thank you for talking to me.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, you're welcome. Bye-bye. Thank you, committee.
Okay. Okay, thank you for this question.
Thank you so much, sir. It appears that we have one question left, and the question comes from Diana Rifda, and I quote, "What are the examples of tasks which use focused corrective feedback and example of tasks which use unfocused corrective feedback, which teachers usually give to students?" Thank you, sir.
Well, if you're going to do focused corrective feedback, you first of all need to decide which particular feature you want to focus the correction on. So if you want to focus the correction on articles, a good task to give them would be a story to write because when people are writing a story, they have to use a lot of articles, right? So asking students to write a story, perhaps showing them a picture story, and then asking them to tell that story would be an example of a focus task for articles. If you want to design a task that involves, say, prepositions of time, then you would need to design a time that perhaps gave people an outline of a schedule or a biography of someone's life, the main events that happened in their life, and they had to use that to write a paragraph to write about their life. And you can then plan the information that you give them that they have to include in their paragraph in such a way that they have to use prepositions of time, like in with months, in with centuries, etc. At with particular times, at 3 o'clock. So you can design tasks which require learners to use the particular grammatical structure that you want, and that enables you to focus your correction on whether they are using the correct preposition, the correct articles. Another one very easy is past tense. You get them to report something, and then they have to use past tense, and you can correct any errors they've made in past tense. So really you need to be a little bit creative and to try to think of what grammatical structure you want to focus on, and then what is the writing task that will really cause learners to try to use that grammatical structure, right? I call those focus tasks. I hope that helps, Linda, Diana.
Okay, it seems to be that is the last questions, and thank you so much, sirs, for answering all the questions. It is a privilege to hear your lectures. Now I give it back to Ms. Linda. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I hope you have a really great conference.